You didn't arrive here by accident, but not in the way that phrase is usually used. This is not about destiny selecting you or the universe arranging clicks behind the scenes. It's simpler and more unsettling than that. Attention doesn't move randomly. It follows resonance. Long before you consciously decided to watch this, something in you was already oriented toward it. Not curiosity in the casual sense, not boredom, not the desire to be entertained or informed, but recognition. Recognition is different from interest. Interest reaches outward toward something new. Recognition tightens inward around something familiar that has no clear memory attached to it. It feels less like learning and more like remembering, less like discovery and more like proximity. If you notice even a slight sense of that right now, a subtle leaning forward internally that is not being produced by these words. It was present before the words arrived. This moment didn't begin when you pressed play. It began earlier beneath conscious awareness, and what you're encountering now is simply the surface expression of a shift that has already taken place. That matters because it changes how you listen. If you believe this video is doing something to you, you'll wait passively evaluating, agreeing or disagreeing, deciding what to keep and what to discard. But if you sense that something has already moved inside you, then this is no longer instruction, it's confirmation. A mirror doesn't add features to your face. It reveals what was already there whether you were looking or not. That is the role this moment is playing. Not catalyst, not teacher, not authority. Mirror, and mirrors are uncomfortable precisely because they remove plausible deniability. Once you see yourself clearly, you can't honestly claim you didn't know. You can look away, you can distract yourself, you can decide not to act on what you saw, but you cannot unsee it. That's the irreversibility people rarely talk about. Perception reorganizes in one direction only. When a pattern is recognized as a pattern, it never again feels like randomness. When a belief is seen as an assumption, it never fully regains the solidity it once had. You can continue to behave as if nothing changed, but it will feel like acting because on some level, you'll know you're pretending. This is why moments of recognition often arrive quietly, not with fireworks or certainty, but with a subtle sense that something has shifted orientation, like a compass needle settling into a new direction. The world looks the same, but it no longer feels the same, and that difference is difficult to explain because it didn't happen at the level of thought. It happened beneath thought in the way meaning is assigned before language gets involved. You may already know this territory. You may have felt it as a vague dissatisfaction that couldn't be solved by changing circumstances, or as a fatigue that didn't come from effort but from repetition, or as a sense that you've outgrown certain ways of seeing the world, even if you couldn't articulate what would replace them. None of that means anything was wrong with you. It means your perceptual framework was changing. Most people are taught to think of change as something they initiate deliberately. A decision, a plan, a goal. But the most consequential changes don't start that way. They start as reorganizations of perception. And perception is not under conscious control in the way behavior is. You don't decide to see depth instead of flatness. You don't choose to suddenly hear harmony where you once heard noise. Those shifts happen when the underlying system reaches a point where the old configuration can no longer hold. What breaks is not the world but the lens. From the inside, that often feels like confusion before it feels like clarity because the familiar reference points stop working before new ones are consciously available. That intermediate space is uncomfortable, and most people rush to fill it with explanations, labels, or distractions. They try to turn recognition back into curiosity, to make it something optional, something they can sample and then put down. But recognition doesn't behave like that. It doesn't ask for your opinion. It doesn't negotiate. It simply presents itself and waits to see whether you'll acknowledge it or spend your energy trying to outrun it. This is where irreversibility comes in. Once perception reorganizes, resistance becomes the only alternative to integration. You can't go back to not knowing. You can only choose how honestly you live in relation to what you now see. That's why this moment carries a certain weight without drama. There's no threat here, no promise, no demand that you change your life immediately. But there is an implicit truth: whatever has already shifted in you will continue to express itself, whether you consciously engage with it or not. Ignoring it doesn't stop it. It just creates friction. And friction is exhausting. This is why people often describe this phase as feeling tired without understanding why, or restless without a clear object of desire. The system is spending energy maintaining an outdated alignment. Something inside knows the old map no longer matches the territory, but the conscious mind hasn't yet accepted that a new map is required. So it keeps trying to navigate with tools that no longer fit. What you're doing right now, simply by staying with this, is allowing that gap to narrow. Not because I'm giving you information you didn't have, but because naming something reduces internal conflict. Clarity doesn't always come from adding insight. Sometimes it comes from removing ambiguity. You don't need new beliefs. You need accurate language for experiences you've already had. That's the only function of what follows. To put words around sensations, patterns, and intuitions that have been operating without names. When something finally has a name, it stops feeling like a private anomaly and starts feeling like part of a coherent process. And coherence is calming to the nervous system. It doesn't solve everything, but it reduces unnecessary fear. Fear thrives in vagueness. It diminishes when patterns become visible. This is why I'm not asking you to believe anything. Belief is too crude a tool for what's happening here. Belief operates at the level of ideas. Recognition operates at the level of perception. You can believe something without it changing you. Recognition changes you whether you want it to or not. That's why arguing for belief is unnecessary. If this resonates, it will do so without persuasion. If it doesn't, no amount of convincing will make it land. And that's fine. This isn't a message meant to reach everyone. Not because it's special or hidden, but because it only becomes relevant when a certain internal condition is already present. You can't force recognition. You can only notice it when it arrives. So consider this an invitation to pay attention, not to agree. Pay attention to your body as much as your thoughts. Notice where something tightens or relaxes. Notice what feels obvious rather than impressive. Notice what feels strangely familiar rather than novel. Those are the signals that matter. Everything else is noise. As we move forward, nothing new will be added to you. There will be no upgrade, no download, no transformation delivered from the outside. What will happen, if anything happens at all, is clarification, a sharpening of what you already sense, a reduction of internal static. And once clarity appears, even briefly, you'll understand why going back was never really an option. Not because you're obligated to move forward, but because you'll see that the version of you who could fully live in unawareness no longer exists. And pretending otherwise is far more exhausting than facing whatever comes next. Most people expect change to feel like movement, like progress measured across time, but what actually occurs in the deepest shifts is closer to an internal stop. Not a slowdown, not a crisis, not a dramatic collapse, but a clean cessation of an old mode of operating. One moment, the familiar machinery is running, producing the same interpretations, reactions, assumptions, and self-referential loops it always has, and then without warning or announcement, it simply isn't. There is no explosion, no emotional crescendo, no sense of something heroic or tragic taking place. The system that once felt inevitable just fails to initiate again. Like software that no longer loads, not because it was attacked or forcefully shut down, but because it has quietly become incompatible with the current environment. This is why people often miss the moment when it happens. They're waiting for intensity, for proof, for some external marker that confirms significance. But significance at this level doesn't announce itself. It registers as absence, the absence of compulsive interpretation, the absence of urgency, the absence of the familiar inner commentary that once felt synonymous with being alive. The mistake is to interpret this absence as emptiness or loss, when in fact, it is space. And space feels unsettling only to systems that are accustomed to constant activity. What has stopped is not thinking itself, but a particular configuration of thinking that revolved around maintenance, maintaining an identity, maintaining coherence with past narratives, maintaining the sense of being someone moving towards something. When that maintenance cycle ceases, the mind doesn't immediately replace it with a new one. There is a pause, a neutral interval. And because we are conditioned to associate pauses with danger or failure, many people mislabel this moment as a breakdown. But a psychological breakdown is characterized by fragmentation, overwhelm, and loss of functional orientation. What is happening here is the opposite. Orientation becomes simpler, not more chaotic. The field of perception becomes quieter, not louder. Emotional tone flattens not in the sense of numbness, but in the sense that fewer things provoke exaggerated response. A breakdown scatters attention. Perceptual reorganization gathers it. A breakdown feels like being pulled apart. Reorganization feels like nothing is pulling at all. This distinction is subtle, and because it is subtle, it is often overlooked or pathologized. Someone may say, "I don't feel like myself anymore," and assume something is wrong, when what they are actually noticing is that the reference point called myself is no longer generating signal. The self didn't shatter. It simply stopped asserting itself as the center through which everything must pass. That's why this shift so often arrives in ordinary moments. Not during crisis, not during peak experiences, not during spiritual rituals or decisive life events, but while washing dishes, walking down a familiar street, staring out a window, sitting in traffic, listening to a conversation that suddenly feels distant. There is no external trigger that matches the internal consequence. Nothing happens, and yet something is no longer happening. The former operating system doesn't announce its resignation. It just fails to boot. And because nothing external changes the mind, initially assumes nothing internal has either. Only later does it become clear that reactions that once arose automatically no longer do. Old anxieties fail to ignite. Old narratives don't hook. Situations that once demanded interpretation now register as simple sensory data. This is not detachment in the dissociative sense. It is intimacy without interference. Experience is no longer filtered through the constant question of, what does this mean about me? When that question stops generating urgency, reality feels strangely direct. And because there is no dramatic emotional spike, people often doubt the legitimacy of the shift. They think, if this were real, it would feel bigger. But perceptual reorganizations don't feel big. They feel obvious in retrospect, like realizing you've been reading a word wrong your entire life and now you can't remember how you ever misread it. There is no effort involved, no pride, no sense of achievement, just a quiet recalibration. This is why nothing external needs to happen for the shift to occur. External change is often used as a justification for internal movement, but here the causality is reversed. The internal configuration changes first, and only later does the external world begin to appear differently, not because it has changed, but because it is no longer being processed through the same filters. This can be disorienting because the world continues to demand responses that belong to the old operating system. Social roles, expectations, timelines, ambitions, conflicts all assume a subject who is driven by lack of urgency and projection. When those drivers go offline, participation becomes optional rather than compulsory. You can still engage, but you are no longer compelled. And compulsion is the clearest marker of the old system. The new configuration is not more moral, more enlightened, or more correct. It is simply quieter. It does less. And because it does less, it reveals how much unnecessary effort was previously being expended just to sustain a sense of continuity. This is also why the shift is irreversible in the way that matters. You can simulate the old patterns. You can remember how to think the old thoughts. You can even re-enter familiar emotional states if circumstances strongly provoke them. But you cannot fully believe in their centrality again. They no longer feel like the truth of who you are. They feel like temporary weather passing through a larger, more stable field. That field was always present, but it was obscured by constant activity. When the activity stops, even briefly, the field becomes obvious. And once it is obvious, it cannot be forgotten. This is the quiet ending that people don't talk about. Not the ending of life, not the ending of struggle, not the ending of personality, but the ending of a certain kind of inner noise that once felt indispensable. It doesn't require preparation. It doesn't reward effort. It doesn't respond to willpower. It happens when the system has exhausted the usefulness of its previous configuration. And when it happens, it doesn't feel like becoming something new. It feels like no longer needing to be something at all. There is a fundamental difference between knowing something intellectually and knowing it in the body, and the difference is not a matter of depth or effort, but of location. Intellectual knowing lives in thought. It is representational. It operates through symbols, language, memory, comparison. You can acquire it, store it, repeat it, refine it, argue with it, and discard it without altering the structure of your experience. You can know many things intellectually and still live exactly the same way, react the same way, feel the same tension in the same situations, because intellectual knowing does not reorganize the system that produces perception. It sits on top of it. Embodied knowing, by contrast, does not sit anywhere. It is not content. It is not an idea. It is a change in how the nervous system is calibrated to reality. It does not feel like information arriving. It feels like a pattern stopping. This is why people who undergo this shift often say, I didn't learn anything new, and yet everything is different. What changed was not what they think, but how thinking itself arises. Recognition lives in the nervous system because the nervous system is what decides, long before thought appears, what matters, what is threatening, what is relevant, what can be ignored. When that calibration changes, reality is experienced differently, even if the same thoughts are still available. This is why embodied knowing cannot be learned in the conventional sense. Learning implies accumulation, practice, repetition, gradual improvement. Embodied knowing arrives as a reorganization. It is closer to waking up from a dream than to mastering a skill. You cannot practice waking up. You either are awake or you are not. And once awake, pretending to be asleep requires effort. This is also why it cannot be reversed. You can distract yourself. You can override the body with stress, fear, or urgency. You can temporarily fall back into old patterns under pressure. But the baseline has shifted. The nervous system has updated its map of what is real and what is not. It no longer invests the same energy into imagined threats, projected futures, or inherited narratives. And because this update did not arrive as a concept, there is no concept that can undo it. Thought cannot argue the nervous system back into a previous calibration, once it has registered safety, coherence, or presence at a deeper level. This is also why embodied knowing cannot be explained cleanly. Explanation relies on shared symbols, but embodied recognition is pre-symbolic. It happens before language. It is felt as a change in tone and timing and reactivity in the way attention moves or doesn't move. People struggle to articulate what's happening to them after the shift because language was designed to describe objects and events, not absences and reorganizations. How do you explain that something is no longer happening? How do you describe the loss of a background tension you didn't even know you were carrying? The mind reaches for metaphors, spiritual language, psychological models, neuroscience, anything that might translate the experience into communicable form, but none of them feel sufficient. They all point in the right direction without landing. This often creates a secondary frustration. The experience itself feels stable and clear, but the inability to explain it makes people doubt it socially. They sound vague. They feel misunderstood. They worry they are making it up because they can't present it as a clean narrative. But this difficulty is not a flaw. It is evidence of where the knowing lives. Information can be shared easily because it is modular. Recognition cannot because it is systemic. It changes the whole without isolating a part. This is why someone can listen to the same explanation you give and nod along, understand every word, and yet not recognize what you are pointing to. They may even agree with you intellectually, but agreement does nothing. Until the nervous system itself registers the shift, the words remain abstractions. This is also why embodied knowing often feels oddly private, even isolating. Not because it makes you special, but because it removes you from a shared hallucination of urgency and interpretation that most social interaction is built on. You are still present, still functional, still capable of participating, but the internal driver that once made everything feel personal, dramatic, or consequential has quieted. Trying to explain that to someone who is still fully identified with that driver can sound dismissive, detached, or evasive even when it isn't. And so people often stop trying to explain. Not out of superiority, but out of accuracy. They realize that no amount of talking will transmit what was not learned through talking in the first place. Recognition spreads not through persuasion, but through resonance. Someone hears something, not the words, but the tone behind them, and something in their own nervous system pauses. That pause is the doorway. Everything else is commentary. After a perceptual shift, the most noticeable change is not a new belief system, a new identity, or a dramatic emotional state, but a change in resolution. Things look the same, yet they do not register the same way. This is not mysticism, and it is not pathology. Nothing supernatural has been added, and nothing psychological has broken. What has changed is the fidelity with which experience is processed. Like switching from a low-resolution display to a higher one, the content does not change, but the clarity does. Edges sharpen, noise becomes more obvious. Patterns that once blended into the background stand out without effort. This heightened clarity is often subtle at first, and because it is subtle, people may doubt it. They expect altered perception to feel dramatic, euphoric, or destabilizing. Instead, it feels quietly precise. There is less blur between what is happening and what is being imagined about what is happening. Sensory input arrives more directly with fewer overlays of interpretation. Sounds are just sounds, but they carry more information. Silences are no longer empty. They are filled with detail. Emotional cues in other people become easier to detect, not because one is hypervigilant, but because there is less internal noise competing for attention. This increased sensitivity is not fragility, it is discrimination. The nervous system is no longer spending energy dampening reality in order to maintain a narrative so it can register finer distinctions. Along with this comes a reduced tolerance for incoherence. Incoherence here does not mean disagreement or complexity. It means misalignment between signal and behavior, between words and tone, between stated values and lived patterns. Situations that once felt merely tiring or boring now feel actively uncomfortable, not in an anxious way, but in the way static feels uncomfortable to the ear once you've heard clear sound. Conversations that loop without substance, environments driven by constant urgency without direction, routines maintained solely out of habit rather than relevance begin to register as noisy. This is often misinterpreted as irritability or withdrawal, but it is neither. It is the nervous system responding accurately to interference. Importantly, this state is not dissociation. Dissociation involves a reduction of sensation, a numbing or distancing from experience, often accompanied by a sense of unreality or detachment from the body. What is happening here is the opposite. Sensation is more vivid, not less. The body feels more present, not absent. Emotions still arise, but they move through more quickly because they are not being amplified by secondary narratives. There is less fragmentation, not more. People often confuse increased resolution with detachment because they associate emotional intensity with aliveness. When intensity drops, they assume engagement has dropped as well. In reality, what has dropped is distortion. Engagement becomes cleaner. You can be fully present without being entangled. This clarity also reveals misalignment in environments that were previously tolerated. Workplaces, social circles, daily schedules, even physical spaces can start to feel off, not because they are objectively bad, but because they were calibrated to an older internal configuration. The body notices before the mind can justify it. You might enter a room and feel a subtle contraction. Not fear, just a sense that the signal-to-noise ratio is poor. You might leave a conversation feeling drained without being able to point to anything that was wrong. This is not judgment, it is feedback. The system is no longer willing to expend energy compensating for incoherence. Routines that once provided structure now feel mechanical. Habits maintained out of identity rather than function lose their grip. This can be confusing because nothing external has necessarily changed. From the outside, life looks the same. From the inside, the cost of maintaining misaligned patterns becomes more visible. And because this perception is embodied, not conceptual, it does not arrive with a ready-made explanation. People often ask, "What's wrong with me?" or "Why can't I tolerate this anymore?" assuming a deficit where there is actually an upgrade. The challenge is that clarity does not come with instructions. It does not tell you what to do. It only makes it harder to ignore what is not working. This is where many people struggle, not because the perception is destabilizing, but because their lives were built around tolerances that no longer exist. The nervous system has recalibrated, but the external structures have not yet caught up. This gap can feel like restlessness or alienation if misunderstood. Properly understood, it is simply the lag between internal resolution and external adjustment. The key point is that nothing has gone wrong. There is no disorder, no spiritual bypass, no emotional shutdown. There is just less buffering. Reality is arriving with higher fidelity, and higher fidelity reveals distortion more clearly. Over time, as environments, relationships, and routines are adjusted to match this clarity, the sense of misalignment decreases. What remains is a quieter, more coherent way of moving through the world, where attention is not constantly pulled by noise and presence, no longer requires effort. The friction phase begins when an internal reorganization has already taken place, but the external world has not yet responded. Nothing dramatic announces its arrival. There is no clear before and after moment that others can see. From the outside, your life appears continuous. You go to the same places, fulfill the same roles, speak to the same people. But internally, the operating logic that once made these structures feel workable has quietly shifted. This creates friction, not because something is wrong, but because two timelines are now out of sync. Your perception has updated while your environment is still running on an older configuration. This mismatch is the source of the strain that starts to appear in work relationships and obligations. It is not a personal failure, and it is not a sign that you made a mistake by changing. It is simply what happens when internal coherence increases faster than external adaptation. In this phase, work often becomes the first point of tension. Tasks that once felt manageable begin to feel heavy, not because they are harder, but because their underlying purpose no longer aligns with your nervous system. You may notice that meetings feel strangely hollow, goals feel abstract, or productivity feels disconnected from meaning. This is not laziness or burnout in the traditional sense. It is the body registering that effort is being expended in directions that no longer make sense internally. You might still perform well, sometimes even better than before, but the cost feels higher. There is less psychological reward for compliance. The same is true in relationships. Conversations that once flowed easily may now feel repetitive or misattuned. You may find yourself less able to engage in performative emotions, less willing to mirror expectations that feel inauthentic. This can create subtle distance, not because you care less, but because you are no longer unconsciously regulating the emotional field for others. Relationships built on shared habits, rather than shared presence, often strain here. Again, this is not because the relationship was fake or worthless, but because it was calibrated to an earlier version of you. Obligations of all kinds begin to feel tighter. Social commitments, family roles, even self-imposed standards can start to feel constrictive. What used to feel like responsibility now feels like inertia. The important distinction is that this strain is temporal, not moral. It is about timing, not inadequacy. Your internal system has already reorganized, but the structures around you have not yet had time to respond or be renegotiated. The friction comes from holding both realities at once. One part of you knows that something fundamental has shifted. Another part is still living inside commitments made before that shift. This can create confusion because the mind wants a clean narrative. It wants to label the discomfort as a problem to solve quickly. But the friction phase does not resolve through force or immediate action. It resolves through allowing the lag to exist without turning it into self-blame. Confusion is normal here. You may feel uncertain about what you want even though you are clearer than ever about what no longer works. Direction often dissolves before it reforms. This can be frightening, especially for people who are used to competence and clarity. There may also be grief, and this is often unexpected. You are not only grieving people or roles you might outgrow, you are grieving versions of yourself that made sense of the world in simpler ways. You may miss the ease of belonging, the comfort of certainty, the satisfaction of external validation. Even if those things were limiting, they provided structure. Letting them loosen can feel like loss. This grief does not mean you want to go back. It means you are human, and transitions involve mourning as well as movement. Many people try to bypass this phase by forcing change too quickly or by suppressing the discomfort and pretending nothing has shifted. Both strategies tend to increase friction rather than resolve it. Forcing change can destabilize external systems before internal clarity has fully integrated. Suppression leads to numbness or irritability. The friction phase asks for something less dramatic and more difficult patience with ambiguity. It requires trusting that internal reorganization has its own timing and that external alignment follows gradually, often through small, unglamorous adjustments rather than sweeping transformations. It also requires normalizing the sense of being in between. You are not broken and you are not lost. You are between versions of coherence. The strain you feel is information, not evidence of failure. Over time, as you respond to this information with honesty rather than panic, work begins to shift, sometimes through changes in role or pace, sometimes simply through clearer boundaries. Relationships either adapt to the new level of presence or reveal where adaptation is not possible. Obligations are renegotiated, released, or reframed. None of this happens all at once. The friction phase is a passage, not a destination. Its function is to surface misalignments that were previously masked by unconscious tolerance. When understood this way, confusion becomes a sign of transition, not regression. Grief becomes a sign of integration, not weakness. And the strain itself becomes evidence that something real has already changed, even if the world has not yet caught up. Feeling different is often misunderstood as a change in personality, attitude, or values, but what is actually shifting is the signal you are emitting, not the traits you consciously identify with. Personality is largely a surface structure, a set of behaviors, preferences, and narratives shaped to function within a given environment. A signal, by contrast, is deeper and more fundamental. It is the baseline pattern of coherence your nervous system broadcasts before you say a word, make a choice, or explain yourself. When that signal changes, the system that once organized your interactions reorganizes as well, even if your Vnishnya behavior appears mostly the same. This is why people often say they feel different long before they can articulate what has changed. Nothing about their character may seem altered on paper. They may still be polite, competent, caring, and familiar. Yet something in how they occupy space, respond to stimuli, and regulate attention has recalibrated. That recalibration is what others sense. Human beings are exquisitely sensitive to shifts in signal because social survival has always depended on reading states beneath language. Long before complex speech evolved, nervous systems learned to detect safety threat, congruence, and instability through tone, timing, posture, micromovements, and emotional rhythm. Those capacities never disappeared. They operate continuously in the background, informing intuition, comfort, and trust. When your internal signal changes, it is registered by others at this pre-verbal level. They may not know what they are noticing, but they feel it as difference. This is why others often sense a shift before you speak about it, and sometimes before you are even fully aware of it yourself. The signal leads, language follows. When your system becomes more coherent, less fragmented, or less willing to perform incongruent roles, that coherence alters the field around you. You pause differently before responding. You tolerate less distortion in conversation. You no longer automatically mirror emotional states that don't belong to you. None of this requires confrontation or explanation. It happens quietly through absence rather than assertion. And absence is often more destabilizing to relational systems than overt change. Many relationships rely on subtle, unspoken agreements about regulation. Who reassures whom, who smooths tension, who absorbs discomfort, who stays small to keep things predictable. When your signal shifts, those agreements are disrupted even if no one has named them. Others may feel slightly ungrounded around you, not because you are doing something wrong, but because the familiar feedback loop has changed. They might describe this as you being distant, intense, distracted, or not the same even when your behavior hasn't dramatically shifted. What they are responding to is not personality, but calibration. Relational tension often emerges here without any argument, boundary setting, or explicit conflict. Conversations may feel stiffer. Humor may not land the same way. Silence may stretch longer than before. You may notice people projecting explanations onto you, assuming motives you don't recognize. This happens because the nervous system seeks causality. When the expected signal is missing, the mind invents stories to explain the discomfort. These stories can sound personal, but they are usually attempts to restore predictability, not accurate readings of your inner world. Importantly, this tension does not mean you have become unrelatable or superior. It means the relational dynamic was partially organized around an older signal that is no longer being transmitted. Energy broadcasts before language because energy is the language the body understands first. Before words are processed, the nervous system has already assessed coherence, threat, openness, and availability. This is why you can walk into a room and immediately feel the mood without anyone saying anything, or why a single sentence spoken in a certain tone can carry more weight than a long explanation. When your internal alignment changes, your energetic broadcast changes with it. You may speak fewer words, but they land differently. You may offer less reassurance, but more clarity. You may no longer feel silence, and that alone can shift an entire interaction. People sense this because their systems are responding to a new pattern. The key reframe here is that feeling different is not about becoming someone else. It is about becoming less filtered. The signal you are broadcasting is closer to your actual internal state, with fewer compensations layered on top. This can feel exposing at first, both to you and to others, because it removes buffers that once smoothed over misalignment. But it is also why the change feels irreversible. Once the system stops broadcasting a false or outdated signal, reintroducing it requires active distortion, not effortlessness. You can perform it for short periods, but it no longer feels natural. Understanding this helps prevent unnecessary self-blame. You are not responsible for managing others' discomfort with a signal shift they don't yet understand, nor are you obligated to explain yourself before you have language for what's happening. The tension is not a failure of communication. It is a lag between energetic reality and conceptual understanding. Over time, some relationships will recalibrate to the new signal, finding a different, often more honest rhythm. Others may fade, not because of conflict, but because their structure depended on a signal you no longer emit. This is not something to force or fix. It is a sorting process driven by coherence. When you stop interpreting feeling different as a personality flaw or social problem and start seeing it as a signal shift, the experience becomes less alarming. You recognize that what's happening is systemic, not personal. Energy leads, language follows, and relationships adjust accordingly. The work is not to convince others of who you are, but to stay present with the signal you're actually broadcasting and allow the relational field to reorganize around it in its own time. After awakening, fear does not vanish, dissolve, or get transcended in the way popular narratives often suggest. What changes is not the presence of fear, but its role in the internal hierarchy of authority. Before awakening, fear functions as a stop signal. It appears and behavior halts. Its sensation is interpreted as a directive: don't proceed, don't speak, don't risk, don't disrupt. The nervous system treats fear as synonymous with danger, and danger as something to be avoided at all costs. This makes sense in an unexamined operating system. Fear evolved to protect the organism from physical harm, social exile, and existential threat. But in modern human life, the same circuitry is routinely activated by symbolic risks: disapproval, uncertainty, loss of identity, loss of status, or the collapse of familiar narratives. Prior to awakening, the system does not differentiate between a tiger in the grass and the discomfort of stepping outside a known role. Both are encoded as threat. Fear becomes the governor of behavior, silently shaping choices while masquerading as common sense, intuition, or realism. After awakening, fear is recontextualized. It no longer occupies the position of command. Instead of acting as a stop signal, it becomes data. It is something noticed, not obeyed. This does not happen through bravado or suppression. In fact, suppression keeps fear in control by making it adversarial. The shift happens when awareness moves from identification with fear to observation of fear as a physiological and informational event. Fear is felt fully in the body, but it is no longer automatically translated into a behavioral conclusion. The question changes from "what should I do to make this feeling stop" to "what is this feeling signaling, and is it describing reality or protecting an identity?" This distinction is subtle but decisive. Discernment replaces reflex. Discernment is not the absence of fear, it is the ability to differentiate between types of fear. One type is legitimate danger signals that correspond to real risk of harm, violation, or irreversible consequence. These fears are grounded, proportionate, and usually clear. They sharpen perception rather than narrow it. They invite caution, presence, and appropriate boundaries. The other type is ego-protective fear, signals generated when a structure of identity anticipates disruption. This fear is often louder, more repetitive, and less specific. It speaks in absolutes and catastrophes. It predicts humiliation, failure, abandonment, or loss of self, rather than concrete harm. It arises most strongly at thresholds of growth, truth-telling, and alignment. Before awakening, both types feel identical because the system has not learned to discriminate. Fear equals stop. After awakening, the nervous system begins to sense the difference. Ego-protective fear tightens the body, accelerates thought, and pulls attention into imagined futures. It demands immediate resolution, usually through avoidance. Danger-based fear, by contrast, brings a focused stillness. It heightens situational awareness and tends to quiet unnecessary mental noise. Learning to feel this difference is part of the post-awakening recalibration. Fear does not disappear because it is not a flaw. It is an information channel. What disappears is its unchecked authority. This is why people often report feeling fear more clearly after awakening, not less. When fear is no longer repressed, rationalized, or obeyed automatically, it can be felt directly as sensation, heat constriction, vibration, alertness. This clarity can be surprising. Many assume awakening will produce constant calm. Instead, it produces honesty. Fear is allowed to be present without being in charge. This is unsettling at first because the old contract was simple. Fear appears, action stops, safety is restored. The new contract is more complex. Fear appears, is examined, contextualized, and then either heeded or overridden based on alignment rather than comfort. This requires a level of internal authority that is unfamiliar. It also explains why fear loses its governing power without losing its presence. Authority shifts from emotion to awareness. Awareness does not argue with fear, shame it, or attempt to eliminate it. It listens, evaluates, and decides. This is not a mental process in the abstract sense. It is embodied. The body learns through repeated experience that fear can be present without catastrophe following. Each time action is taken in alignment, despite ego-protective fear, the nervous system updates its predictions. Over time, fear's intensity often decreases, not because it is suppressed, but because it is no longer reinforced by avoidance. Fear that is consistently obeyed grows stronger. Fear that is consistently examined loses its leverage. Importantly, this does not mean reckless behavior or ignoring genuine danger. Discernment sharpens precisely because fear is no longer conflated with threat. When real danger appears, it stands out more clearly against the background noise of habitual anxiety. Many people find that their judgment improves after awakening, not because they feel less, but because they feel more accurately. The emotional signal-to-noise ratio improves. Another key shift is that fear stops being interpreted as a sign of incapacity. Before awakening, fear is often taken as evidence that one is not ready, not strong enough, or not meant to proceed. After awakening, fear is recognized as a companion to transition. It marks the edge of the known. It does not mean stop, it means pay attention. This redefinition removes much of fear's moral charge. You are no longer failing because you are afraid. You are simply encountering the boundary of a familiar identity. This understanding is deeply regulating. It allows fear to coexist with movement. Courage in this context is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to grant it veto power over truth. Over time, this changes the entire internal economy. Decisions are no longer made primarily to minimize discomfort. They are made to maximize coherence. Fear is consulted, not obeyed. It becomes one input among many bodily signals, values, context, timing, and intuition. This is why fear does not disappear but loses its grip. Its job changes. It is demoted from ruler to advisor. And like any advisor, it is sometimes correct and sometimes biased. The awakened system does not need fear to vanish in order to function well. It needs fear to be properly placed. When fear is no longer the primary organizing principle, life opens in a different way. You still feel hesitation, uncertainty, and vulnerability, but they no longer dictate the boundaries of your existence. You can act with fear present, speak with fear present, and choose with fear present without collapsing into it. This is not numbness, it is maturity. It is the nervous system learning that survival and truth are not always the same thing, and that sometimes the greater danger is not the risk of change, but the cost of perpetual self-protection. Real urgency is quiet. Artificial pressure is loud. This distinction matters because many people confuse the two and either rush themselves into misaligned action or delay endlessly while waiting for fear to disappear. Artificial pressure is generated externally or internally through threat narratives. Act now or you'll lose everything. Decide immediately. Or you failed, move before you're ready, or you'll be left behind. It hijacks the nervous system by creating panic, narrowing perception, and collapsing time into a false emergency. Under artificial pressure, urgency feels sharp, anxious, and compulsive. It pushes rather than invites. It relies on fear of loss to motivate movement. Real urgency, by contrast, does not shout. It does not coerce. It arises as a clear, grounded recognition that a particular moment is structurally different from others. It is not about danger, it is about alignment with timing. You feel it not as panic, but as a steady pull, a sense that something is available now that will not be available in the same way later. Real urgency is not threatening, it is honest. It says this configuration exists now. It will change. What you do with it is up to you. Understanding temporal windows of readiness requires stepping out of moral or spiritual frameworks that frame timing as reward and punishment. There is no cosmic penalty for hesitation, no divine scorekeeping that marks delay as failure. What exists instead are conditions. Just as certain plants only germinate when temperature, moisture, and light align, certain internal shifts are supported by specific configurations of the nervous system and life context. These configurations are not permanent. They arise when multiple factors converge: openness, exhaustion with old patterns, sufficient clarity to see misalignment, and enough stability to tolerate change. Openness alone is not enough. Many people are open but not ready because they are still invested in maintaining familiar identities. Exhaustion alone is not enough either. Burnout without clarity leads to collapse, not transformation. Clarity without openness becomes rigidity. Readiness emerges when these elements intersect. In such moments, perception reorganizes more easily because the system is no longer defending old structures with the same intensity. This is why certain insights land at specific times in life and not others. It is not because the information was unavailable before, but because the system could not receive it without destabilizing itself beyond its capacity. These windows feel urgent, not because something bad will happen if you miss them, but because something precise is happening now. The internal landscape is temporarily configured to support a particular shift. That configuration is shaped by life events, accumulated experience, nervous system capacity, and psychological timing. As life continues, those variables change. Responsibilities increase or decrease. Relationships shift. Energy rises or falls. The system adapts. When the configuration changes, the same opportunity does not disappear entirely, but it no longer appears in the same form. Delay is not punished. Opportunity simply evolves. This is a critical reframe. Many people resist urgency because they associate it with manipulation, scarcity, or coercion. They have been pressured before and learned to protect themselves by slowing down or disengaging. That protection is understandable. But real urgency does not demand immediate action for its own sake. It invites recognition. It asks you to notice that you are standing in a particular alignment of conditions that supports movement now with less resistance than later. If you delay, you are not wrong. You are not failing. You are choosing to move under different conditions. Those conditions may be heavier, more complex, or more diluted. They may require different forms of effort. The cost of delay is not punishment, but friction. This is why urgency can coexist with compassion. You can acknowledge that a window is open without turning it into a threat. You can say this is available now because you are unusually open, unusually clear, and unusually tired of pretending. That combination will not remain static. It will shift as your life shifts. If you act now, you move with the current. If you wait, you will still move, but against a different flow. Artificial pressure collapses time into a false now. Real urgency expands time by revealing context. It allows you to see past, present, and near future simultaneously. You sense not only what is happening, but how it is likely to change. This is why real urgency often feels strangely calm. There is gravity without panic. You may feel seriousness, even weight, but not frenzy. The body feels grounded, not hijacked. Another important distinction is that real urgency does not come with a script. It does not tell you exactly what to do. It simply clarifies that something wants to move. Artificial pressure, by contrast, often comes bundled with instructions, deadlines, and binary outcomes. Real urgency respects agency. It recognizes that readiness is not obligation. You are allowed to decline a window. You are allowed to say not now. Doing so will not anger the universe or block your growth forever. It will simply mean that the next opening will look different and require different capacities. This understanding removes the drama from timing. It also restores responsibility. Instead of asking, "What will happen to me if I don't act?" the question becomes, "What conditions am I choosing to act under?" This is a more adult framing. It treats you as an active participant rather than a subject of fate. Many people sense urgency most strongly during periods of transition loss or liminality because those periods loosen identity structures. When old narratives no longer fully work and new ones have not yet solidified, the system is more permeable. Insight travels faster. Resistance is lower. This can feel destabilizing, which is why the mind often wants to delay until things feel settled again. But settlement often brings rigidity. When things stabilize, the same insight may still be accessible, but it will require more effort to integrate because the system has rebuilt its defenses. Again, this is not a punishment, it is mechanics. Real urgency simply points to this mechanics without moralizing it. Finally, it is important to emphasize that urgency is not constant. Living in perpetual urgency is unsustainable and usually a sign of artificial pressure. Real urgency comes in waves. It appears, clarifies, and recedes. When a window closes, it closes quietly. There is no alarm bell. Life simply reorganizes. You may look back later and realize with neutrality rather than regret that something was available then that is no longer available now. That realization is not meant to haunt you. It is meant to educate your timing literacy. Over time, you learn to recognize real urgency by how it feels grounded, clear, non-coercive, and strangely intimate. It feels like recognition, not demand. And when you act from that place, even when the path is uncertain, the movement carries less internal resistance because it is aligned with the conditions that made the movement possible in the first place. There are 3 common mistakes people make after a perceptual shift, and they are common precisely because they are understandable. Each one is an attempt by the system to regain stability. Each one makes sense from the inside, and each one, if followed unconsciously, creates more disorientation rather than less. Naming them clearly matters not to induce self-criticism, but to reduce confusion about why things feel harder when you're trying to cope in familiar ways. The first mistake is trying to reverse the shift. This usually happens quietly. You don't announce it to yourself as going back. Instead, you tell yourself that maybe you overinterpreted something, maybe you're tired, maybe things will feel normal again if you just rest, distract yourself, or return to old routines. You double down on familiar structures. You consume the same content, replay the same conversations, reenact the same roles, hoping the previous operating system will reboot. This impulse is deeply human. The nervous system prefers predictability, and reversal feels like the fastest way to restore it. The problem is that perceptual reorganization does not work like a mood or a belief. Once a pattern of seeing has collapsed, it cannot be reassembled by effort. You can suppress awareness, numb it, or drown it in noise, but you cannot unknow what reorganized itself. Attempting reversal creates internal friction because part of you is now acting from information the rest of you is pretending not to have. That split drains energy. It produces fatigue, irritability, and a sense of quiet dishonesty with yourself. The destabilization doesn't come from the shift itself. It comes from trying to live as if it didn't happen. The second mistake is skipping integration. This one often appears in people who are articulate, insightful, or used to competence. There is a recognition, a moment of clarity, and immediately the mind wants to translate it into a new identity, a new philosophy, a new life plan. You try to operate everywhere from the new perception at once. You expect your work relationships, emotional patterns, and sense of purpose to instantly align. When they don't, frustration sets in. Skipping integration is understandable because insight feels complete. It arrives whole. The system assumes that because the seeing was instantaneous, the living must be too. But insight reorganizes perception faster than the nervous system habits and relational structures can adapt. Integration is the process by which the body behavior and environment slowly catch up to what perception has already registered. When you skip it, you create chaos. You make decisions without sufficient grounding. You burn bridges unnecessarily. You overwhelm yourself with change. Or you collapse into disappointment when reality doesn't transform on the same timeline as awareness. This destabilizes not because the insight was wrong, but because the system was asked to perform beyond its capacity. The third mistake is isolating completely. This often comes from a sense of being unrelatable or misunderstood. After a shift, familiar conversations feel shallow or misaligned. You may notice patterns in others that you can no longer participate in without discomfort. The instinct is to withdraw entirely, to conclude that no one can meet you where you are. Some degree of withdrawal is natural and even necessary. Discernment increases. Certain dynamics fall away, but total isolation removes mirrors. Without any relational feedback, the mind can spiral into overinterpretation, rigidity, or self-reference. Integration requires some contact with reality as it is lived, not just as it is understood. Isolation becomes destabilizing when it is driven by avoidance rather than clarity. It cuts off regulation, reflection, and grounding. Humans integrate through interaction even when the circle becomes smaller and more selective. Against these mistakes sits integration itself, which is rarely glamorous and almost never dramatic. Integration is slow, repetitive, and often boring. It looks like making the same small, aligned choice again and again. It looks like noticing when you're about to react from an old pattern and pausing just long enough to choose differently. It looks like letting insight inform behavior incrementally rather than all at once. There is no rush, no peak state to maintain, no performance to perfect. Integration unfolds through consistency, not intensity. This can be disappointing to the part of the mind that wants transformation to feel extraordinary. but it is stabilizing because it respects the pace at which the nervous system learns safety in new ways of being. This is where patience needs to be reframed. Patience is often misunderstood as hesitation, fear, or lack of commitment. In reality, patience is intelligence applied to timing. It is the capacity to sense how much change a system can absorb without fragmenting. Patience does not mean doing nothing. It means doing what can be sustained. It means allowing insight to settle into muscle memory, emotional response, and daily rhythm. Impatience often masquerades as courage, but it frequently leads to collapse or reversal. Patience, by contrast, builds coherence. It allows the new perception to become lived rather than merely understood. Integration is also where trust develops, not as belief, but as embodied confidence. Each small, aligned action reinforces the sense that you can live from what you know without everything falling apart. Over time, the friction decreases, not because the world has changed dramatically, but because your system has learned how to move within it differently. The shift stops feeling like an event and starts feeling like a baseline. That is the real sign of integration, when what once felt destabilizing becomes ordinary and you no longer need to reference the moment of change to justify how you live now. None of these mistakes mean something has gone wrong. They are part of the terrain. What matters is recognizing them early enough to adjust without self-judgment. The work after a shift is not to accelerate, explain, or retreat. It is to stay present, move deliberately, and allow time to do what force